everyone. It is your girl, Marcy Thomas, and I am so glad to be here with you again for another episode of the BGC Book Club. I am coming to you from the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, and it's just an exciting time for us to be here. Exciting time for us to be able to discuss books by Black women, by, for, and about us, and tonight is no exception. So as you come on in the room, if you don't mind, you can let us know whether you've been here before, if it's your first time, if it's your 50th time, whatever the case may be, and where you might be joining us from as we prepare to get into a really wonderful conversation about a book that I truly enjoyed and can't wait to dive into. So tonight's book is Grown Women by Sarai Johnson. So, y'all, this is a good one. Get ready to get your copies. So let me tell you a little bit about Sarai. She is a writing educator in the DC metropolitan area with over 10 years of experience. Her career started in lifestyle journalism, where she worked for the Indianapolis Star, the Alexandria Gazette, and DC Modern Luxury. She's worked with writing nonprofits Shout Mouse Press and Writopia Lab, and taught writing at Howard University and American University, where she earned degrees in journalism and literature, respectively. She currently teaches full-time at Howard University while working on a second novel, of course, after she returns from her maternity leave, which we may talk a little bit about that here momentarily. She grew up primarily in the South in Nashville, Tennessee, where she spent most of her time hanging out by creeks and eating catfish, which are still some of her favorite hobbies to this day. She currently lives in Alexandria with her husband, 2 children, a 3-year-old and an 8-week-old, believe it or not, and her dog. So without any further delay, let's welcome Sarai Johnson to the BGC Book Club. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, yes. I am so excited to have you here. Oh, Myra's joining us from Chattanooga. It's your first time. Okay, so you're Tennessee homie. All right. Thank you, Myra, for joining us. So yes, first of all, congratulations on 2 babies, the new baby that's 8 weeks old, as well as your book baby.
Thank you. It's a very exciting to have both a new baby and a new book at the same time. They definitely complement each other in weird ways. I call them the twins.
Mm-hmm.
They came into the world at the same time, approximately.
Wow, that's pretty exciting. And I know that means you're very, very busy. So everybody, if we hear a baby crying, we know why, just in case we do. So, well, tell us a little bit about what was it that made you want to write Grown Women, because you've been writing and doing a bunch of things. You've been teaching others how to write. But where did the kind of the impetus for writing Grown Women actually come from for you?
So Grown Women came from writing fiction sort of privately for myself. I've done that since I was a little girl. Probably in college, I started writing this character, Camille, and she's the youngest generation in Grown Women. And a question started to come to me of like, where did she come from? And it became clear to me that, we're all the product of generations before us. So I sort of started writing a short story, actually, that was kind of explored where Camille came from. And when I started doing that, I sort of got into this space of thinking about my own relationship with my mother and how that dynamic has shaped me as a woman and the choices that I've made and my journey into motherhood.
Mm-hmm.
So it started with just sort of this smaller idea of where Camille came from, and it ended up being this bigger thing about preparing myself to become a mom myself.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yes, it definitely is a book about womanhood and motherhood, how the two intersect, how sometimes the two diverge from one another. So that is really, I find that interesting. So you said Camille started in college, and then over time you built on and then decided to flesh it out into a full novel.
Right.
Yes. So one thing, well, just give us a little synopsis of what the book is about, and then we can dive a little bit more into some questions.
Sure. So Grown Women is about 4 generations of mothers and daughters. We have Evelyn, Charlotte, Corinna, and Camille. They deal with generational trauma as they work to raise Camille. The story begins with Charlotte, who is pregnant, teenage, newly fled from sort of an abusive but upscale household. She originally does not intend to keep her daughter Corinna, but does, for reasons that I hope become clear in the book, or semi-clear, because I'm not sure they're ever really clear to Charlotte, but she keeps her daughter. Her life doesn't change, however, until she becomes a grandmother to Corinna's daughter, Camille. When Charlotte and Corinna realize that they maybe have their hands full with a very talented young woman, they reach out to Evelyn for the first time in probably 30 years to help raise Camille. And while they're raising Camille, they are sort of given opportunities to rethink and redo some of their own relationships and trauma. And the book is ultimately about forgiveness for one's own sake, but also about how do we move past our pain, move past trauma, not past it, but on from trauma.
Yes, and it's so funny that you said that. I definitely got that from the book because, I had a chance to finish it yesterday, both reading as well as audio. So for those of you who like audio, there is an audio available. But as I was kind of marinating on it today in preparation to talk to you, that was one of the things that really stood out to me, is that it really is about forgiveness and what that means, and do you forgive, and what it means when you forgive, and what if you don't. Just all those sorts of things. There's love, there's loss, there's just so many different themes that you touch on in the book, and that's why I feel it's just a really important read, because how many of us in our families with the different generations of women, if we were to really go back and look at them, not just how they mothered, but just who they were, and maybe how they were mothered, and how that impacted us. If we ever took the time to really do that deep dive, we might come to some conclusions that we didn't necessarily think, that we would come to earlier on.
Right. For me, I realized I didn't necessarily need to know what happened to my mom as much as I needed to know. I needed to sort of feel empathy for her and understand that she had challenges that I would never face or never understand, and that all of those challenges impacted how she mothered me. But I also have an opportunity to sort of do things differently, to think more critically about the choices I make and the trauma that I have, because I have more resources, partly due to maybe sacrifices that she made. And understanding that gives me a lot more empathy for her. And though I don't think forgiveness necessarily needs to mean that you embrace the person that you forgive, that you sort of run back to this person to allow them to treat you however they were treating you. But I think it can be, it is healing to forgive. And I think that's something the women in the book hopefully understand or grow to understand.
Yes, there's definitely growth. So I want to ask you a little bit about just we'll get into some of the individual characters here momentarily, but just even the structure of the book. It's very, those of you all who decide to read it or listen to it, you got to pay attention because this book starts in the 70s and it goes up into the early part of the 2000s. And it's told like different people are kind of sharing their different perspectives. So we have Evelyn, Charlotte, Corinna, and Camille sharing their perspectives along the way. So from your perspective in writing the story, what was it that made you want to write it in that way?
So I wanted the structure to sort of mimic what kind of is happening in the story.
Mm-hmm.
So it is not a fully linear
Mm-mm.
tale because healing is not a linear process. So it's sort of, it becomes, I think, more cohesive as they move forward. The timeline becomes more clear. The different perspectives, I try to see different events through different eyes, and it was important to me that it's not, that information doesn't always come to the reader at the same time or in places that it would be obvious, I guess, that that's what's happening. So when I originally wrote it, I wrote it straight through, like in the correct timeline, like the fully linear chronological direction, but it didn't give the sort of, also didn't really allow the characters to have the arc that they needed to have, I felt like in order for sort of Corinna and Charlotte to have sort of a come from one place to another place, I felt like it couldn't be based fully chronologically.
Right.
The reader needed to understand other things.
Right. First. It puts me in the mind of, for anybody who has watched This Is Us, because those stories on This Is Us are not told, all in one straight line. You might see something, if you've ever watched it, you see something happening now, then it'll go back, kind of like a flashback to see what's happening, or it does show different perspectives, because the reality of it is people can be in the same household and going through the same things and seeing it totally different. So it is kind of good to be able to get the different perspectives, because sometimes, especially when someone does something that we don't think is nice or good, it's easy to formulate an opinion without really having an understanding of who they are. And I feel like you do a good job of fleshing out the different characters so that we can, even if we still don't like their choices, at least we have a better understanding of why they may have made those choices.
Right. That was very important for certain characters to me. That sort of I hope explains sort of the way we're introduced to Corinna's perspective. We see her first from her mother's perspective and then her daughter's perspective. And she comes off as sort of aloof, problematic, not necessarily connected to her daughter. And then we meet her and we realize she's had her own struggles, her own trauma. She had her own experiences of these moments that we've seen before. And that, I believe, is something I hope we can all do and think about for every individual that we come across.
Right.
How did they get here? What happened to them?
What happened to them? Now, one thing, as the book begins, even though Evelyn is the elder, we don't really see her until a little bit later in the story. So again, with it not necessarily being linear, you kind of hear about her, but you don't really know who she is until a little bit later. But what I find interesting is that with her, we really get the introduction of, what should I say, the black bourgeoisie. She's an educator. She's teaching where you teach. She's doing a lot of things. She's, an educator. She's living this high life that's very different in DC. That's very different from what her other three generations are actually doing in Tennessee. So I like seeing that her character, because she is so different from the others. And there are points, and we'll get to that here in a moment, without telling it all. So for those of you who haven't watched before, we're not going to give you spoilers. So you still need to read this book, just be clear. But we see where they might want to introduce her into the story. But starting with Charlotte, she really has had kind of a tough time.
Right. Charlotte, I think, has had perhaps the toughest time. And she struggles with what to do with what happened to her. She struggles with how to be a mother and how to be a grandmother also. And she realizes, or she considers, is she the best person to raise her granddaughter? She sort of gives her granddaughter up, and that's not giving anything away, to her mother, who she has very serious issues with. And that, to me, felt like a sacrifice. It was a sacrifice that she made for her granddaughter, but also to her daughter in a way, by sort of offering opportunity to her daughter's daughter. She offers something to her own daughter. And I think that sort of promotes healing for them as well.
Yes, because Charlotte, as you know, she's described as the cynical daughter, and she has a lot of reasons to be cynical. There are things that she's gone through, and this isn't giving anything away. She is the one that made the decision to leave the family home and move to Tennessee for a reason that you have to read to find out. But, when she goes away, she really is trying to find herself and figure out how she wants to live, how she wants to raise this child that she has, who is Corinna. And sometimes she doesn't necessarily make the best choices. She's a woman who's in pain. And we see that show up in a lot of different ways.
Yes. It was also important to me to show, like, though Charlotte is trying to do things differently than her mother, that doesn't necessarily mean better. We see that she makes different sorts of mistakes with Corinna than her mother made with her. And it's because I don't think she has the time or the energy, the resources, or the healed sort of consciousness to stop and think about what she's done and what she's doing and how she's sort of inflicting her pain on her daughter.
I have a comment. So I think I'm understanding the title more. So it's more saying grown, evolving women. Absolutely.
So the grown women part, the grown women in the Black community, that often means like you're sort of done, right? Like you're ready to start, raising kids, being responsible for kids, and you have all the answers in a way. And I don't think that that's necessarily a place where you can stop and think and do more for yourself and for your family. So it's almost facetious in that way, that if you're grown and you're done, you cannot come to a sort of place of healing. But also, I think there's a character who accepts themselves as grown, and that sort of has a negative impact on the way she's able to connect with her family.
Right, because if you're completely grown, there's no room for growth. Right. Yeah, where's the growth if you're completely grown? And we all have room and space for that. But just in seeing Charlotte specifically, there are things that she is really, trying to raise her daughter and later on her granddaughter, trying to raise herself because she's relatively young when she, moves away from Evelyn and has to start making some, decisions about her own life. And, we watch her be in relationships. She gets married and she's married to someone that I don't know if she really loves him like that or not, at least not early on. But, it's sometimes I feel like she does, and other women sometimes make a choice because they feel like it's a safe choice, at least in that moment.
Right. The choice to be grown, for her, I think, is sort of a place of survival. She felt threatened by where she was, and feels threatened by the world. She doesn't feel safe, I don't think. And she makes choices to kind of protect herself, or she thinks she's making choices to protect herself. And we sort of see that with our ancestors, I think.
Right.
And she thinks that she's grown, she's done. This is what, and she does not grow out of a certain feeling that I definitely think has a negative impact on her ability to connect with her family.
Yes. I'm just thinking about not saying too much because we're not giving anything away, but you're right about that sometimes it can be a root and it's just so rooted in you that you just can't let go of it. And there are always consequences to that, of holding on to something so tightly when maybe you could let loose of it just a little bit. There can be challenges with doing that. But looking at her daughter, Corinna is I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm getting them right. Corinna is next. All the C's, making sure I get them in the right order. But Corinna, she is kind of more, I would say, not the freest of free spirits, but more so than her mother, Charlotte. And I think that's what it's like just in the timeline that she was born. She was born into a different time, so she would have pursued life a little bit differently. So that's a thing in the book as well, because we get to see these generational differences.
Right. They each get a different set of opportunities presented to them based partially on the time that they are born and also the circumstances in which they're born. I'm glad that you stumbled on the C because that's on purpose. They are the three C's, the Charlotte, Corinna, Camille. They sort of start in the same place of, the C. And I sort of wanted the reader to think about how easily each of them could wind up in the other circumstances. Like what different choices would the woman before them have had to make for them to wind up in a sort of different place. So that is on purpose. I'm sure I'm going to get some.
Right. That's why I had to look at my notes like 3 C's.
So, where were we?
Talking about Corinna and her kind of her journey, because hers is different from her mother's, of course, as it would be. But just seeing her and how she kind of grew up underneath Charlotte and some of the decisions that she started to make, which were different and took a different path.
Right. So Corinna, Charlotte's daughter, was raised by a mother who was clearly very disconnected from her, was maybe not interested in being a mother to her. It's never really clear exactly. I think it's never really clear to Charlotte exactly how she feels about having become a mother when she did. And Corinna feels the impact of that. She feels the impact of knowing that her mother maybe didn't want to be her mother. And that shapes Corinna's sort of ability to move through the world in really interesting ways. I think she is desperate for connection. So when she becomes pregnant, she keeps her baby because she is seeking this connection, this love. And she, unlike Charlotte, takes a lot of time to think about how she can make things different for her daughter.
Right.
She is very focused on being the great mom, the good mom, and she makes a lot of mistakes in doing that. But she's always trying, and I think that's an important characteristic of that character, is that she is always trying, never gives up.
Yes, she's definitely always trying. She does some things with her baby daddy that are different from what her mother may have done or was able to do. She's really always thinking about Camille and her future, and what does it mean to raise her? What advantages might she need that she didn't have? All those sorts of things, and it does inform her choices along the way. But I also like that with her, we get to see her she's out there and she's working and trying to make money and stuff like that to survive, to be able to survive on her own and raise her daughter. But along the way, we see her latch onto a skill set that will serve her later on as the story evolves. So I do like that about her character in particular, that, she's trying to do her best as a mom, but she's also trying to be her best person for herself as well.
Right. I think that's ultimately the difference between Charlotte and Corinna. I think Charlotte is maybe hung up in anger, while Corinna is, and we see her do it again and again. And I'm not, the readers can make their own judgment about whether or not the way that she sort of shakes off what's happening, her circumstances, so that she can just move forward, is that's how she sort of manages to keep going, is to just sort of shake it off. And I think she's a really resilient character. I hope that readers see that about her, that she's resilient, that she's also not perfect, but she is very smart. I think she's very smart.
She's very smart. And I like seeing imperfect characters because we're imperfect humans, right?
Right.
And I think sometimes if you make people too perfect in a story or in a book, they're not as believable, because it's like, wait a minute, nobody's that perfect.
Right. I mean, that's part of where my motivation for the book comes from, is like, I felt that I was reading a lot of Black mothers who were either, perfect. They always knew the answers. They're sort of like sage-like characters, angelic also.
Right.
Or they're like completely incompetent, sort of crackhead sort of images. And I felt like that was not true to my experience, and it's not true to practically any experience that I've come across. And Black women deserve representation that is complex. So I really wanted to make sure that each character has different bad characteristics, negative characteristics, and also positive characteristics. Hopefully there's something to root for in each of them, more so in others, some in others.
Right. Right. Definitely more some than others. But of course, we already know that Corinna ends up having Camille. And as you already alluded to, situations are very similar. It's almost like we hear about these, some people say a generational curse, but, like each generation is kind of doing the same thing in and around the same time. And just looking at Charlotte and Corinna, well, maybe not so much Charlotte, but with Corinna, she was looking for some like love and acceptance, like you said, and wound up being in a situation very similar to the one that her mom was in terms of having a child at a young age, that part of it. But Camille comes along, and oftentimes in a family, it's like that new baby, that new grandbaby, whatever the case may be. It's this chance of hope and something different with this new, precocious little character that comes into the space. And that's when, you've already mentioned this, we start to see some things a little bit different in Charlotte with her granddaughter than what it necessarily was even with her own daughter, Corinna.
I think Camille is sort of the beacon of hope, right? She's the newest, she's the youngest, she's the blankest. And something I wanted to also think about is like, we're born blank. We're born free of the trauma in a way. And our parents have choices that they can make about where we will be, where we will grow up, and how we will experience their experiences also. And because it seems that sort of Charlotte has had some time with her pain to soften towards her daughter, especially because she sees her daughter in a similar situation that she was in.
Right.
I think she's able to behave differently. She's had space from her sort of incident. She's had enough time to really sit with what happened to her and be able to do differently.
Right. And even with her husband, same thing. Is like they had a very tumultuous relationship up until about the time the grandchild comes along. So really the baby Camille really is kind of starting a process of everyone thinking about how they function and what they can do differently.
Right. I think I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why grandparents often sort of become grandparents, and they're very, very different. It was not necessarily my experience. For me, though, when I realized that I wanted to be a mother, I realized I had work to do.
Mm.
And I think Corinna realizes that as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we see that along the way, when she starts reading some books and different things like that, she's trying to learn, what it means. But, because Camille is so talented and, potentially could have some opportunities, this is when we do bring Evelyn kind of back into the picture. Because before we kind of knew she really wasn't a main character. There were some secrets about who she was and where she was, or if she even still was alive, things like that. But, later on, she comes into the story. And as we've already mentioned, she's in DC. She's an educator. She's doing all of these things. And because she lives this sort of privileged life, they figure for Camille, leaving Tennessee would be beneficial for her to be able to, take advantage of some of the things that her grandmother's life can offer her.
Right. Evelyn is introduced to us through very distant perspectives. I think she sort of is introduced as a villain, a haunting presence. And she feels like a threat to Charlotte because of her past, but Corinna sees her very differently. She sees her as an opportunity for her own daughter, and their sort of clashing perspectives on Evelyn create tension between them, but also sort of cause them to hash out some of their own issues. And when Camille goes to live with Evelyn, she has sort of all of these opportunities available to her, but she also has these expectations from her mothers, she calls them, her great grandmother, her grandmother, and her mother, who each have kind of different ideas of, who she should be, what she should be pursuing, and how she should pursue it. And she does a lot of what she's told to do and doesn't really seem to find pleasure in that. And, and what I think when she is able to sort of develop her own interests and pursue her own interests, she becomes sort of more herself, but also is sort of able to think about the sacrifices that came so that she could have these opportunities. And I think she's very grateful for those. But they also she is able to think about, is being free a gift that they've given me, as opposed to doing what they told me to do. And I think that's a really interesting element of the story, is what is doing what you're supposed to do more of a gift to your ancestors, or is doing what you want to do more of a gift to your ancestors?
Right. That is so true, because we've already kind of touched on the fact that depending on when you came up and where, because location plays a factor as well. Your opportunities could be very different. And so, Evelyn, she's up in age, or at the time that that she really becomes a real part of the story. So some of her ideas are different. Plus, she is this person who's living this I'm highly educated and, people are looking to me because I am this expert. She just has a certain kind of life. She's able to, buy the fanciest things and live in the nicest house. And, so her perspective is definitely different than what, the other two mothers would have been just because of where she is in her life. And so, but in seeing that, understanding that Charlotte and Corinna kind of wanted Camille to be there, it also just really makes you think about, well, how do we determine what's advantageous and what's not?
Right. I mean, what's really interesting also, I think, or important to me about Evelyn's character is that she has sort of everything that we think a successful person has, right? But she also is deeply hurting herself. That's why she has hurt her own daughter in this way. She has sort of punished herself in various ways. Though it may seem from the outside that she has everything that she wants. And I think Charlotte is able to see sort of the flip side of,
because she knows.
She experienced Evelyn's sort of not preoccupation. She's very focused on her career. She experienced that, but also she experienced Evelyn's pain in a way. And just because there's money involved doesn't mean that there's, love involved. I think it does work out differently, again, because there's been space and time to sort of consider choices that were previously made.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing just about life in general, that I always say everything I read, I try to take something away from it. And I guess in terms of Evelyn specifically, it's the thing of understanding it. Just because you have it all on the surface doesn't mean that everything is okay underneath. And that oftentimes a person on the outside looking in can really think, oh, they've got this and they're doing that and they're winning this award or whatever it is that's going on. This person, they're getting all of this notoriety, or, in this day and age, they've got 1 million, 2 million, 3 million followers or whatever it is. And you can make assumptions about what that person's life really is. But that doesn't mean that there aren't internal battles that they're dealing with. It doesn't mean that they don't still experience loss or pain, or, that they don't still make mistakes that, that are hard to recover from just because they have all of these things that look good on the outside.
Right. You never really know a person, right? And I think that's also apparent with Charlotte, who sort of comes from this upscale background, but sort of leaves that to become sort of a working class individual who does not hardly at all take pleasure in material things the way that her mother did.
Hey, Laura, I haven't seen you in a minute. Good to have you back. So this is so intriguing because the story sounds very familiar. I admire you for taking on such a multifaceted, psychologically and emotionally challenged scenario. I look forward to reading. Yes, it absolutely is all of that. You will be your feelings about some of the stuff, because as I mentioned, I was listening to some of it, and there were a couple times like, say what? No, they didn't. No, she didn't. Rewind, go back, like, what was that?
I hope you enjoy it. I hope that the dedication is for Margot May, who was my daughter, and all the daughters before her. And I really hope that readers are sort of able to gain something from any of the characters, or rethink any of their own sort of problems or issues.
And just, the whole generational aspects. When I was telling my mom about the book, I'm like, it's kind of like me, her mother, and her grandmother. Like, if there was a story written about the four of us, what would that story look like? Just looking at our lives and how, we've all come to be. And, because I can honestly say that my life is very different from, my mother, my grandmother, and my great grandmother. Just even the way I like functioning in the world is very different. So it's similar to looking at a Camille. It's like she ultimately starts to make, as she ages, because of course we see her as a baby and she grows and all those sorts of things, but we see her at a certain point start to make choices that are her own that look very different from what the people around her have made.
Right. And at some point in the book, I don't think this is giving too much away, somebody says Camille is so self-centered, and someone answers, that was kind of the point, right? We wanted her to be able to focus on herself in a way that, we were not able to. And I think that's definitely true for Corinna and Charlotte. They were not able to sort of explore or take advantage of various opportunities because of various reasons. So giving our coming generations the opportunity to sort of explore and become themselves on their own is, I think, an important element of the book.
It's definitely an important element of the book, but I'm just thinking in life in general, because I think of so many people that I know that maybe they didn't have support to go and do something different or be something different. It's like this expectation. And we see a little bit of that of Evelyn with Camille. It's this expectation. Oh, well, you're going to do this, or you need to do that, or you should pursue this career. And, this career maybe is more acceptable than that other career. But, to get to a point where they can even open up their hearts and minds to say, you know what? Maybe she needs to find her happiness and her joy and her bliss in her own way, and not the way that we think that it should show up.
Right. And I mean, the shoulds come from a place of like care, right? But it could be harmful for us to also embrace other people's shoulds. I think I call them shoulds. Like, this is what you should be doing. This is what you should be doing at this age. This is what everyone else is doing or should be doing. And I think it's actually, it's really beautiful to be able to sort of pursue your own interest, your own sort of self, because we no longer live in sort of the spaces that our parents come from. Like, it's definitely have much more freedom than my parents, because not only the time, but also because of sacrifices that people like us have made. And I think taking advantage of that is really important.
It definitely is important to be able to do that. So, of course, once all the women are now connected in a way that they weren't before, because they are in the process of raising Camille, we get to then see how some of the stuff plays out in the relationships, like, who gets close, who doesn't really get close. I'm not telling you all of that, but we do get to see those different dynamics. And I guess that's the case in any family, that especially if there is trauma, if there are things that people, have held close to the vest, or, carried in their heart or their spirit for a very, very long time, when you're thrown back into a situation with them, it doesn't mean that everything is going to be, roses and chocolate, so to speak, because you're all back together. So that's when we really get to see that play out.
Yeah, I think some women are sort of already have sort of a beautiful bond. I mean, it's Charlotte and Camille have like a really strong bond, and that survives. And these other women have to work a little bit harder to sort of bond. And I think, and some women choose not to bond at all. And I think all of those choices are things we have to think about. What bonds are we going to nurture, and what bonds do we let fall by the wayside? What bonds are important to us, and it's not necessarily going to be our mother, I think.
Right. Not always. And that's just important in general as I think about it, because How many times in families, and I mean, I've experienced myself, people be like, oh, well, you need to be whatever with whomever because they are, whatever their space in the hierarchy of the family falls. But, there is a level of freedom that's available to you when you can make a decision to say,
right,
maybe not.
yeah. I think that also, I mean, it can also go back to sort of the forgiveness thing from earlier when we're like, forgiveness doesn't have to look like embracing this person, though they've hurt you or though they've made you uncomfortable or whatever. Like, just we get to choose what bonds we nurture and water and grow.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Grown women, growth in women. There you go. We get to choose. We get to make those choices. And, we see all of these things, play out throughout the story. Y'all know we're not going to tell you everything. So I definitely suggest that you read it because it is rich. I would suggest, though, maybe if you read it a little slower than me. I do because I'm, doing these interviews and want to be able to have an intelligent conversation with the guests. But there are just so many different things that you might need to sit there and really think about it for a minute because there are complexities in the characters. There are complexities in the story that you might really need to sit and think about, especially if it's things in there that maybe you are dealing with in your own story.
Right. I think we don't talk enough about sort of damaged mother-daughter relationships. It's not very well represented in media, I don't think. If it is, it just accepted that like mothers and daughters have difficulty between them. And like for me, my relationship with my mother was troubled. And I felt a lot of shame about that. And I didn't really talk about it, or I didn't talk about it the way that maybe I should have been. But when I opened up and started sort of talking about my story with people, I realized that they had similar experiences. I was not alone in having this difficult relationship. And thought to myself, why not? Why don't we see that? Like really look at those relationships. And there are some texts like, I mean, Beloved,
Mm-hmm.
Sula, those books definitely influenced how I approached this book. Um, in the sense that we look really closely at the relationships and sort of the
Mm-hmm.
impact a mother has, the choices a mother makes has on a daughter.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because throughout the book, you also, because of the type of work that Evelyn does, the types of things that various characters read, you do invoke the names of many of our great, Black women writers and just, African American intellects as throughout the book. And I love that you do that because even if it's somebody you haven't necessarily heard of before, you'll be like, oh, wait a minute, I might need to go look this person up because she's talking about it in the book.
Right. There's one woman in particular that was very important to me. I wrote my thesis on Gwendolyn Bennett, and Evelyn is working on a manuscript about Gwendolyn Bennett as well. And she's a lesser known Black Harlem Renaissance poet. Wrote a lot of really beautiful poetry, and people don't know who she is.
Right.
And she sort of later in her life sort of dedicated her life to promoting other people's careers and died ultimately like in obscurity, which was the fate for a lot of Black women writers. We think about even like Zora Neale Hurston,
Exactly.
Nella Larson. They they did not become popular or emerge again until they were sort of discovered by later Black women. So I wanted to, however I could, bring a little light to Gwendolyn, as Evelyn calls her.
Right. And even Laura's like, Gwendolyn Bennett? Yes, we've heard of Gwendolyn Brooks, but
Right.
Gwendolyn Bennett? And I mean, I'll admit I've heard of her just because over the years, in the 15 years of Brown Girl Collective's existence, I've done a deep dive into like Black women who have done great things throughout history. So I'm definitely familiar with the name, but a lot of people just wouldn't be if they have not, had the opportunity to do that. But since we brought her up, are there works of hers that are available that people could go and read if they wanted to?
Yes. One of my favorites is Heritage. I think that's definitely my favorite poem.
Okay.
I don't think she published a collection, but she's in a lot of collections, Harlem Renaissance collections. There's what is the name of it? There's a collection from grad school that I still pick up every now and again. I think it's Women from the Harlem Renaissance.
Okay.
She's in there, and mostly poems. Heritage, definitely. I hope that we can promote Heritage.
Look that up. Heritage by Gwendolyn Bennett, and do a little digging, do a little research, because I do think it's important that we speak the names of the women who have come before us and have paved the way through their writing, even if we didn't hear about them before. As like you said, Zora Neale Hurston, if it wasn't for Alice Walker doing a deep dive, people just love Zora nowadays. I was looking at something earlier today. There's a festival happening for Zora at the end of January next year, and things like that. She's really become popular, but for many years, people didn't even know who she was. So it's just important for that. So I definitely wanted to mention that as well. But in grown women, we see all these women doing things and coming to their own space. By the time we get to the end of the book, they have all kind of chosen a path for themselves and, either had the relationships with one another or not, decided what they were going to do with their careers and love and all of those sorts of things. And it doesn't necessarily look the way that we thought that it might have looked at the beginning of the book.
Right. I think everyone definitely has an arc. Some more so than others. I think I wanted to include sort of a spectrum of how we can deal with our trauma. And I think that each is kind of represented.
Mm-hmm.
Also sort of what it feels like to not receive forgiveness. How does one sort of cope with that is an element. I felt like I saw a lot of redemption in texts that I read, and I was like, I just feel like redemption should be more of a non-linear experience.
Mm-hmm.
That's not quite how, forgiveness really looks,
Right. That's true. And sometimes it doesn't happen. Yeah,
Right.
sometimes, or if it happens, it's quote unquote too late to do anything about it. I mean, it definitely shows up in a lot of ways, because especially, those who are, of the Christian faith were always told, forgive, forgive, forgive. And sometimes I think the words might be said, but the feeling behind it might not necessarily be the case, and it shows up in the actions. But just looking at it, understanding that somebody isn't necessarily always going to forgive you, and you have to kind of be okay with that.
Yeah. You have to live with that. You sort of, and I think there's something to be said about the sort of the decision to let it go instead of to continue to seek forgiveness. I think is sort of, that can be a slight in and of itself. It can sort of disregard this person's feelings and experience to continue to seek forgiveness, especially if you have not necessarily dealt with and come to terms with exactly what you did. up to interpretation whether or not this person has dealt with exactly what they've done, if they've accepted responsibility for it or not. But that person does ultimately stop seeking it.
Yeah, just even in you saying that, it's like there is definitely a selfishness involved in keep asking somebody, oh, but please forgive me. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I'm sorry. Please. You're not allowing them to have their own experience of whatever it is, of you, of whatever happened to them, whatever the case may be. You're not giving them the opportunity to do that.
Right. That sort of should come on its own. And that really the forgiveness happens more within the person forgiving than the person who is forgiven. So we can't ask for forgiveness from a person who isn't ready.
Right.
It won't work. I don't think. Like, it just doesn't function as forgiveness. They're not ready to give it.
Right. See, yeah, they're getting it without reading it yet. Part of becoming grown. Absolutely. Part of it. Yes, to understand that sometimes it's just not, everything doesn't get tied up in a neat little bow all the time. And I think that sometimes, we can walk through life with that expectation. Oh, everything's going to ultimately work out. Like, sometimes it just doesn't. And and that's okay. I feel like as long as people aren't doing things where they're in attack mode, where they're attacking each other or whatever, if they just decide to kind of live their own lives and love or deal with a person from a distance, then that's okay.
Right. If you need distance, you should seek distance, I think. But holding on to anger does not serve you. And I think at the end of the book, a certain character has figured that out, and maybe it's too late.
Yeah, maybe it's too late. So this has been really, really good, Sarah. I appreciate you. I appreciate the book, Grown Women. I'm showing the cover again. Y'all see, I always try to match the covers as much as possible. But I'm matching the cover today. Tell us a little bit about that cover. You told me, but I want you to tell them about this cover. If you can't see it that clearly, it's orange in the background, and they're like silhouettes of women in pink. And then like some little yellow like stars or things in between them. So tell us a little bit about that cover.
So I wanted sunset colors. That was something they had me put together a mood board, and I was very interested in sunset. I think sunset to me is sort of like the end of an arc, the end of the day. But opportunities to sort of reflect on the day, which I hope most of the characters do. And you'll see on the cover there's women in different sort of poses, different states of being. My daughter, who's almost 3, says they're dancing, which I think is interesting to think about how these women sort of dance with each other and with these ideas. And I think it's really beautiful.
It is. And what's inside is good. Got a couple of comments saying, hey, you put it out there, Laura. Sounds like it would make a good TV series.
From your lips to God's ears,
Absolutely. And thank you so much for being here, Myra. I hope you come back. Yes. Or come back or look at some of the old videos, because there are over 200 interviews out there on YouTube. So please do. And, pick up a copy of Grown Women, either the audio, which is done really well, I will say that, or, the book, this was an advanced copy, but it does look like this. But yes, it's a really great story. And I think that there are things that you can really take from it, because there's so much stuff that we didn't talk about, because the whole point is to get you to read it and not to tell you the whole story. So, Sarah, I know that you have a lot going on, your book baby, your real baby, your family, all of that. But what is happening in terms of events or anything that you might be doing in the next few weeks or months that people can come out and actually see you, if if you have anything like that going on.
So I did a few events the week of launch, but I've had to sort of withdraw because of the baby. I will be in Nashville for the Southern Festival of the Book in October. Okay. So hopefully Chattanooga can come. I will be at the Author in the Round event as well as doing a signing the second day.
All right. Well, that sounds really good. Let me see who was Myra is the one said she's going to get. So Chattanooga. How far is Chattanooga from Nashville? I'm not 100%.
About 2 hours, 2-3 hours.
Yeah, that's not that bad because I know I'm in Atlanta and I'm not that far from Chattanooga, so I just wasn't sure what the distance is. And I need to get to Nashville because I want to go to that new the new Black Music Museum that's there. I haven't had a chance to go yet, and I really want to go see that.
I've been there.
You like? Was it good?
It was good. My daughter liked it a lot. So that's always a win.
Yeah. So definitely a 3-year-old or probably younger at the time. Yes. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking forward to doing that. So Myra, hopefully you'll be able to make it out. And just real quickly, for those who haven't had a chance to get a copy of the book yet, there are a couple of places where I have it available at the Brown Girl Collective bookstore, which is at Brown Girl Collective, just that browngirlcollectivebookstore.com. That is for those of you who like to shop on Bookshop. That's where that will take you. And then I also have BGC Books and More, which is on Amazon. And the and more is that there's books there, there's movies there, there's some black dolls. I have some back there. You can't really see mine. But there's all kinds of games, all kinds of stuff on there. Just, the people I like to shop with, all that kind of stuff is there. So those are a couple of options for you. So let's see here. Oh, she said, if you will be in Chattanooga, I hope to see you. So I'm not. And let's see here. What other comment do we have? Oh, yes, you're welcome, Laura. You're welcome. Sarah, I'm going to let you take a water break and so I can announce next week's book. But thank you again for being here. Don't hang up just yet. Okay. But I'll let you take a water break and all of that. And, we'll look to see you again. Hopefully this will be the first of many times we have a chance to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I appreciate it.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So, everybody, thank you for being here. As Sarah said, it was really a pleasure for me to read the book and to have a conversation with her about it because, I read a lot of stuff and this one was really good for me. And it really had me think about, myself, my mother, the mothers, the women who raised me, both on my maternal line as well as my paternal line, because, we think of our direct, mother to mother to mother, but also, we have some mothers on the other sides of our families as well. So it was really good. And I hope that you all will grab a copy of Grown Women and really dive in. So as a point of letting you know what's next week, next Monday, I believe it's the 5th, we will be here with Swift River, which is S.E. Chambers' new book. So be on the lookout for that. Next Monday is also a family story. So, that's where we are right now in a couple of weeks of family-based stories where we can really dive in and, learn some things and experience these characters as they work through different things within their families. So I look to see you next week for the conversation with Essie as well. And in the meantime, everybody, please enjoy yourselves. Stay cool out there. If it's hot, stay dry. If it's raining a lot like it is here in Atlanta, and just enjoy your summer. And we look forward to seeing you again next week. Take good care. Bye-bye.